Hello, everyone. I'm Barry Sullivan, Director of Program Development for the Marconi Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Connecting Maine webinar, an all-in approach for funding sources, community engagement, and sustainability. Before we get started, before I introduce our moderator, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. As you may have noticed, yes, we are recording, and we'll be posting this recording of the webinar. It should be up on the Marconi Society website, I'll say by early next week. And there will also be, after we give our panelists a time to make their presentations, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the session. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A button. That's where you are invited to submit your question for the panel. Feel free to do so at any point, but we will be holding those questions until the end, like I said. With that said, it is my pleasure, my privilege to introduce Tanya Emery. Tanya is the Executive Director of, the Economic Development Director for the Maine Connectivity Authority, and Tanya will be leading today's discussion. So Tanya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you to the Marconi Society for the opportunity to talk today with my colleagues and the community that is working so hard on connectivity in Maine about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And hopefully this will inspire some insights and really share the work that we've been doing and some lessons that we've learned in this work so far. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and give you a little bit of what they're bringing to the table. And I'm going to start with my friend and colleague, Maggie Drummond-Ball.
Thanks, Tanya. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be part of this session today. I know we're going to have a lot of fun and hopefully a very lively Q&A and discussion as well. My name is Maggie Drummond-Ball. I'm the Strategic Partnership Director for the Maine Connectivity Authority. It's a position that I have been in for the last 18 months or so. It's gone by very quickly, and came to this role from a previous role at the Maine Community Foundation, where I was leading our broadband initiative and work on innovation and entrepreneurship, and couldn't resist the opportunity to partner with so many of the wonderful folks who are on the screen here today. And my role at MCA has been to lead our team that's working to build capacity at the community and regional level, and to shepherd our partnerships with state agencies and nonprofit organizations and funders in the field, especially those organizations that are engaged with and working with underserved communities and individuals. And I've been leading our digital equity planning process in partnership with Tanya. And I will hand it over to Marika.
Thank you, Maggie, and hello, everybody. Thank you very much for including me. I'm Marika Visser with the Maine State Library, where I am Director of Library Development, and our department is primarily responsible for ensuring that library staff across the state have the capacity and the skills to provide quality library services and programs that meet the needs of their communities. And prior to coming to the State Library, I did policy and government relations work for the American Library Association. And in that role, I led our digital inclusion portfolio. I mean, before it was called digital inclusion, I guess. And the portfolio focused on broadband access and adoption. And I have a very soft spot for rural and tribal communities and led our work in navigating the connectivity for those libraries and communities. In today's context, I think it's important to call out that my role is always to raise the awareness of the need for digital literacy skills and support, in addition to the broadband access side of the equation. And of course, to highlight the value of libraries as local partners in addressing gaps and developing sustainable solutions. And I look forward to the conversation today. And I will pass it over to Jeff.
Thanks. So I'm Jeff Letourneau. I'm the Executive Director of Network Maine for the University of Maine system. I've been with the university for more than 30 years, so a little while. And through that time, I've had the privilege of working in and now in the last few decades, couple decades, leading our research and education network in the state. We started connecting up rural schools and some libraries back in the early 90s to the National Science Foundation network, precursor or follow on, or yeah, precursor to the internet, as a way to try to bring to those communities access to university and library services across the network. It was never those along the I-95 corridor in the state that had the interest. It was the ones that are a couple hours or more away from the highway that needed to have that level of connectivity, or some level of connectivity, to bring opportunities to their students and patrons to get information. So I'm an infrastructure guy. That's kind of what we do. I've been involved in many of the large infrastructure initiatives in the state in terms of broadband or general network connectivity. And most recently, we partnered with the Maine Connectivity Authority on a middle mile, Maine Connectivity Authority on a middle mile proposal to expand our existing research and education network for an additional 500 plus miles of middle mile access in the state. I could go on, but I was told I had 90 seconds, so I'm stopping. And I'll pass it off to Nick.
Thanks, Jeff. Nick Vitesta, Chief Policy Officer at the Island Institute. Island Institute is a 40-year-old community development organization. We're located in Rockland, Maine, and we work primarily with Maine's island and coastal communities. These are often small, remote communities. They're natural resource dependent communities. 75% of Maine's coastal communities have fewer than 3,200 people, and 25% have fewer than 800. And there we support 6 one-room schoolhouses on the island. Some of these communities are really, really small. Around 2015, Island Institute recognized that the future of these communities was in connectivity, and without connectivity, all of our other work would be significantly challenged, and the long-term prospects for these communities would be dimmer. So we dove into broadband at that point, and I've been working hard on it. I spend time working on broadband, also spend time helping fishermen navigate whale regulations or get into shellfish or seaweed aquaculture, among a variety of other things. So we're deeply enmeshed in the communities, and we care deeply about broadband because of the important role it plays for the future of our communities. I think it's worth saying that in this broadband conversation, Island Institute is a regional and tribal broadband partner with the Maine Connectivity Authority for 2 coastal counties that are at the heart of Maine's fishing communities. And then I've been involved in the leadership of the Maine Broadband Coalition since 2017, and also was the chair of, or still am the chair of, the Connect Maine Authority. We'll talk a little bit more about, there's the Maine Connectivity Authority, there's the Connect Maine Authority. Talk a little bit more about that later, but those are the different hats I'm wearing. And Karam, I think it's over to you.
Thank you, Nick. I'm Karam Durda, Chief Executive Officer of GWI. We are a long-standing ISP that designs, builds, and operates networks in Maine and in Vermont and in New Hampshire. We design, build, and operate networks on our own behalf and on the behalf of municipalities and utility districts. So it's a joyful occasion for me to join this conversation. We have been state, regional, and national participants in conversations regarding open access. We lean into that hard. We're leaders in the belief that net neutrality should be the rule of the day, that internet access is a human right. We've led efforts about digital privacy in the state of Maine, have provided guidance and opinion at the federal level, at the national level, all in the behest of making sure that the citizens of New England and indeed the United States have equal access, universal access. And so that's our oxygen. We're the only B Corp telecommunications carrier in North America, one of two in the world. It's a very proud thing for us. And if the occasion prevails, everybody should check up what a B Corp is all about. So that's me. That's GWI.
Fantastic. Thank you all for giving our participants today some context in terms of why you're here to tell the story. And in the spirit of that, I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit for our first question. Yem, if you can move to the next slide, it would be great. Thank you. What is unique about Maine that is relevant to digital equity and connectivity? And I know that one of the statistics that we cited in our digital equity and broadband plan is the statistic about how much of Maine's population actually qualifies as one of the covered populations under those designated populations. Maggie, do you want to start with this? And then others, please feel free to chime in. I don't want to have to call on people. I'd love to hear people contribute to this as they feel they have something to offer. But I'd love to hear thoughts about what is unique about Maine that's relevant to digital equity and connectivity. And then we'll get in a little bit into the history that will lead us into some of the forward-looking conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Tanya. I think you're on the right track in terms of what's unique about Maine that's relevant to digital equity and connectivity. And we all know that we're a large geographic state that has sparse population and rugged terrain. So it makes it difficult to serve to reach our connectivity needs. And to your point, Tanya, the population viewer that NTIA created to help guide the state's digital equity planning efforts does show us that 89% of Maine's overall population identifies as one of those key covered populations that tend to be most impacted by the digital divide. So when we talked about and engaged in creating our digital equity plan, we knew that we would be planning for virtually every person in Maine as being someone who would be impacted by the digital divide. So that's a challenge. I think one of the things that's really unique about Maine, and I'll be very interested to hear the other panelists' ideas on this as well, but the idea that we're a local control state, that we have very strong community government, and it's often under-resourced, but we always have the opportunity to go to town meeting and vote on the issues that are critical and important to us. So community and local engagement has a very strong history and ethic in Maine. And we have volunteer leaders in our legislature and at the community level. And that means that everyone has to constantly be learning about the issues that we face locally and at the state level. And we have limited county level government, unlike many other states that have a more regional capacity. So all of those things are unique to Maine, and I think give us a strong community base to build from. And also present some challenges in terms of just getting to scale in this work at a regional approach and ensuring that everyone has the information they need to make the decisions that are best for their community. So I'll stop there and welcome others jumping in.
Maggie, thank you very much for that overview. I would add a little bit to that. I hate the word unique because you can always find someone who's pretty darn close. But we do have a lot of challenges in terms of broadband deployment and access. I no longer remember where we're ranking, but we're on the most challenging side on a couple. One is the age of our population tends to be, we're either the oldest or one of the oldest states in the country for our population. We're also, I believe, the most rural in the sense of the greatest percentage of our population lives in rural parts of the state. So unlike some other states of similar population base, they have usually have a large urban center. For example, Alaska has Anchorage, where 80% of their population lives. For us, Portland's our largest city, but I would say maybe 20% of our population lives in the greater Portland area. 80% lives in more rural or rural designated areas in the state. That means it takes a lot of infrastructure to get out to our citizens. So you take a look at that, take a look at the overall age of our population. You look at our geographic challenges from trees and foothills, mountain ranges to granite. We don't bury anything here in the state as the ground's just too hard. Everything's aerial. To the fact that Maine is not on the national footprint infrastructure-wise. Northern New England is, we've always called the black hole of connectivity because everything goes around us. Massachusetts, Boston area is probably it definitely is the closest point that we can touch the national platforms. Otherwise, we're going off to Canada in some way. And currently, there's not a lot of opportunity to be able to do that. So lots of things stacked on top of each other just make the challenges of reaching our population just that much more difficult.
I would just jump in and add to some of what Jeff and Maggie said and underscore the local rule, the community rule in our state. It's a big challenge across a variety of fronts when you're talking about regional projects. But it's also a state, we're also a state where community matters deeply. And I think when I think about the community leaders who are working on broadband in Maine, they tackle large challenges in their community every day. And the only way they get them done is by coming together as volunteers and tackling challenges that everybody else in the world looks at and is like, there's no way you can do that. That's an impossible challenge to tackle. And some of the best work coming out of the state happens when community leaders just ignore that or don't hear that, and they go forward and they tackle the challenges because they need to do it for their community. I think one of the things that helps us, I think that will help us on the digital equity side of things. One of the other things that really helps us as a state is we're a small state. You're never too many people away from somebody with resources or the ability to help you. Our state agencies are just a phone call away. We have very accessible political institutions. The leadership of those institutions cares deeply about all of these 450 some odd small communities that we have in our state.
486 municipalities. Karen, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would also add that Northern New England is also at the cusp of reevaluating its position in the world from a cultural point of view. Connectivity is associated with, as it should, with an opening of the world and the universe at large. And for Northern New England, that is a brand new day. Northern New England, through history, whether it's through social purposes, economic purposes, geographic considerations, has always found itself with some level of insularity and an economic GDP that's generated from its own behest. And right now, in the 21st century, you have the world sort of opening up. Connectivity is one of the tools that leverages that. But that also creates some enormous cultural questions where connectivity results in a population ingress. You know, some of the data that Jeff indicated is absolutely true. What's also true is that The state of Maine, for example, the white Caucasian population has a negative birth rate. The positive birth rate in the state of Maine is through populations that are coming in from other states or immigration. And so that creates another consideration for the populace, which is 1.3 million in a very, very large square mile area, to think about what it means to be part and parcel of a world that it has maybe not had the occasion to seriously consider at a social level. So I would say that that is an important part, because as Maggie's talking about and Nick is talking about going to town hall meetings, it should not be discounted, the questions that come up from the town leaders or the citizens about what it means to them when they have world-class infrastructure that allows for the world to come into a place where they may not have had the occasion to do so prior. And those are some very deep-rooted cultural questions that get answered. So, you know, that probably leads to the tension later, but that is something that should absolutely be considered.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Before we get to that creative tension question, let's talk a little bit about the history. Nick mentioned it in his intro. There was Connect Maine, and now there's the Maine Connectivity Authority. Connect Maine does still exist. It's slightly confusing. Nick, tell us a little bit, and I know Jeff and Karam, you've both been in this space for a long time in Maine, and so you can add some color commentary as to why this transition was necessary and appropriate. Tell us a little bit about the history and previous efforts, what was working in the space and what wasn't, and why it was necessary to evolve, and what you see as the opportunity for MCA and how you hope that we will be able to be effective in the space.
All of that in just a little bit of time. It's a big, big question. So Connect Maine. Connect Maine is the state's legacy quasi-governmental broadband agency. It was formed in 2006 in recognition of the connectivity needs that Maine has. I think that puts it as a pretty early connectivity authority type or statewide broadband institution. And I think over the course of years, Connect Maine provided funding for infrastructure projects and did a little bit of mapping and did a little bit of work here and there. But in 2018, Maine's definition of broadband was 1.5 over about 1. And there was a pretty big struggle at Connect Maine to get that up to 25 over 3, which was the FCC standard at the time. I think one of the things about Connect Maine is it has long been an under-resourced small agency, so a staff of 2, a quasi-governmental agency with a staff of 2 and a board, providing $1 million a year, maybe a little bit less, a little bit to planning in the 2017 on time frame, but mostly for infrastructure builds. And I think the operating theory of the Connect Maine board for much of its history was all of the money that we have should go to trying to solve Maine's connectivity challenges and connecting people who don't have a connection. And we should put all our money into infrastructure, not into any support for the ecosystem, into the data collection, into some of the other things that I think we're seeing are also really important for the effective deployment of public funds. And so, I'm the chair of the Connect Maine Authority Board. Jeff's on the board. We both joined in 2019, late 2019. And there wasn't a lot of accountability for public funds. There wasn't a ton of data collection work happening. There wasn't investment in the sector itself. 2020, COVID happened. Maine passed a $15 million bond for broadband, which was an incredible investment and a huge lift. Many people on the call here participated in that work. We also had about $6 million in CARES funding that we were putting out to connect students, kids who were trying to go to school remotely, but didn't have an internet connection and couldn't participate in school. And that was a big problem. We ended up connecting 700 kids in a very short order, and it was, the Connect Maine Authority will fully fund the building of the infrastructure to connect that house that has a kid who is supposed to be in school and can't because they don't have connectivity. And we spent $6 million and got 700 kids connected. part of what was happening around that time, and one of the things I think we were starting to see, is this influx of money, the need to have a strong statewide institution, good governance structures. We spent a lot of time as a board talking about our governance and our work. But in that moment when we were talking about kids who couldn't go to school because they didn't have an internet connection, GWI put in an application for some pretty dense neighborhoods in Brunswick, South Portland, Biddeford. These are populous cities in Maine. They are, served by many definitions of the word. Various internet providers have infrastructure that pass by these houses or pass by these streets where these houses are on. But there were, over 100 kids who, despite the presence of that infrastructure, were not able to participate in school. They weren't able to go to school remotely because they didn't have a connection. And so GWI's proposal was, let's build the infrastructure to connect these kids, because somebody else who has the infrastructure there isn't making the effort. They aren't connecting them. These kids aren't going to school, and this is working with the principal, this is working with the superintendent. It was pretty heartbreaking to say, as a statewide broadband entity who cares deeply about this, we can't provide that funding. Our institutional structures and our governing laws are such that we can't provide that money to solve this very, very real pressing societal problem. And I think for me, that was one of the moments where it started to become clear that Connect Maine's institutional structure, the amount of staffing we had, the board was just appointed by the governor. It wasn't confirmed by the Senate. That we need to start thinking about how we do things a little bit differently. In 2021, we were working on pulling together an NTIA application. This was going to be a big application, $28 million, 7 projects. Pulling that together, the management of those funds, the management of those projects was starting to, I think, tax the resources and the institutional structures that Connect Maine had. And so in recognizing all of that, we started talking about, is there a new entity? Should we start fresh from a clean slate with what we've learned and provide an entity that has a different governance structure, slightly different way of being in the world, and has the board and the staff capacity to handle all of the funds that are going to be coming to meet today's challenges? And that was really what became the Maine Connectivity Authority. In 2022, Connect Maine and the Maine Connectivity Authority entered into an MOU where the Maine Connectivity Authority provides staffing to the Connect Maine board and carries out the functions that the Connect Maine has in statute. There's a few functions that it has in statute. All of that work is now going through the Maine Connectivity Authority, and Connect Maine's funding has increased to $3 million a year. And that's going to support the work of the Maine Connectivity Authority and the effective deployment of all of these funds, the ARPA funds, the BEAD funds, you name all of the many different funding streams that we have coming. A little bit of funds coming into the Maine Connectivity Authority from Connect Maine, I think, greatly helps ease some of the challenges that comes along when you have overlapping sets of federal funds that don't quite have all the restrictions that line up, or there are gaps between the funds. So I'd leave it there. Connect Maine still exists. We meet quarterly. We get reports from the Maine Connectivity Authority on the activities of the Maine Connectivity Authority, and we provide about $3 million a year in funding to the Maine Connectivity Authority.
Karam, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this creative tension, because it was such an important point in the genesis of the organizations, but it's also going to continue to be a challenge moving forward. And how do you see that, particularly within digital equity, and how do you see that as an opportunity moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think creative tensions or creative problem solving comes in where it requires intentionality. To acknowledge that the problem exists, but intentionality in dealing with a whole bunch of multiple stakeholders to try to solve it. So, I mean, there's some really simple stuff. For example, in the state of Maine, as Jeff mentioned, there are population centers. Within those population centers, there are areas which are distinctly not served. They have crappy internet service. Those areas tend to be low income or immigrant neighborhoods. But yet, $42 billion is not going to help them. It's just not. So what do we do and how do we do it? I do believe to my core, GWI does, that we have a moral, ethical, and financial obligation to solve that, because you are going to then aid and abet a deeper chasming of socioeconomic considerations. So how do we do that? Well, maybe the answer lies in aggregating projects in a way so that the federal capital that comes in that addresses rural areas, if it's a large enough project, you can aggregate in such a way so that the private capital can go into the metro areas. Requires an enormous amount of thinking, requires an enormous amount of creative financial partners, but at least there is a way to try to do it. And I think those are the places where Maine Connectivity Authority certainly has expressed its interest in leaning in and trying to figure that out. It has expressed its interest in trying to figure out how does various other bonding mechanisms may even work. It has expressed its interest in trying to figure out how can it help connect the dots for the ISP, especially smaller ISPs that are not incumbents, on accessing capital stacking mechanisms to be able to do large enough projects. Because the truth of the matter is, the reason why the Rural Electrification Program succeeded in the 1910s or the 20s, or the National Highway Transportation System in the 50s or 60s succeeded, is because of the fact we said, as a society, we're going to get to everyone, no matter how hard it is, no matter how long it takes. And I think that's what we have to do. In the state of Maine, that's one issue. In the state of Maine, obviously, even in the rural areas, for example, there's a tension between what the incumbents may have done or are doing, cherry picking, donating areas, and leaving certain stretches, swaths of land and premises still unserved, but makes it awfully hard for a non-incumbent to put together a competitive proposal for a federal program to say, I can aggregate these projects and I can bring a competitive service to those areas. How do we do that? Again, requires a little bit of creative thinking. Is there a way for the smaller ISPs, when they aggregate projects, to lessen their costs to make the competitive applications sort of bear fruit? Are there ways they can leverage other partners in regional places to say that they can aggregate large projects to be able to bring fruit? Because at the end of the day, the goal for the federal funds that the state of Maine, the state of New Hampshire, Vermont, everybody is trying to administer is, how can we provide universal access that carries some element of choice for the citizens? And I think that's where we have to come in. And I don't buy into reticent positions where we say, well, that's what it is, and these are the rules, and hence that's what's going to be, because that is not going to create infrastructure that's going to last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. I mean, this is a generational moment. It's not going to happen again in my lifetime in terms of a coalescing of a societal demand with the ability of the federal government to put a shoulder into it, and the states expressing an enormous amount of capacity and expertise to solve that problem. So it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I urge everybody to think in terms of running a marathon and to intentionally figure out how to solve some very thorny problems and to acknowledge the tension. We have to acknowledge the tension and say, how do we resolve it? By talking.
Well said. Thank you. Maggie, I would love if you would start us with a little bit of comments around the all-in approach that MCA is leading. We should also make sure that we talk about our broadband capital markets task force, which speaks to the issue of capital, but talk a little bit about the all-in approach and sort of how MCA in the state of Maine is looking at bringing those resources together and the planning approach.
Sure. And just building on Nick and Karam's perspective and comments. I think as we have learned more and more about our colleagues in other states, particular challenges and opportunities, I think we can be really thankful for the partnerships and the foresight that helped to create MCA at this moment in time. And as we've seen other state broadband offices working to scale up to meet the challenge of this moment, I know we're thankful to have the tool, not the tool, but the entity that is MCA to allow us to move quickly, to be nimble and really to try a variety of approaches as quickly as we can to meet the urgency of the moment. So one of the things that MCA has done that we know is a bit unique is first to make the decision that our digital equity and BEAD planning processes would happen in the same place. So within MCA's staff under this umbrella, we would have staff leading each of those efforts, working closely with one another. In some other states, we do see the digital equity and BEAD planning processes happening separately, connected to one another and complementing each other, but happening sometimes within different entities or agencies. So I do think it's a strength and a strong approach to have combined this work in one place. And of course, the opportunity to work with you, Tanya, on that effort. The second thing that we did in the planning process was ensure that we combined the outreach and engagement required for creating the digital equity plan and the BEAD plan together, so that we could maximize the opportunity to engage with our partners and also the attention of Mainers throughout this process, and not exhaust people by going back and forth to ask them to do focus groups or a survey or engage in two different planning processes. So those are both, I think, important decisions that MCA has made. And Barry, I did create a slide in the deck, if you'd advance to it, just to give folks a sense of this all-in approach that MCA has taken in this work with the support of our partners. So what we've tried to do is really ensure that we have something for everyone and provide overlap and allow for flexibility as we work to get all Maine people and communities connected. Recognizing that one approach will not work everywhere. And you can see some of the things that we've employed here towards this challenge. Our Connect the Ready grant programs, working really to proactively engage communities and partners in public-private partnerships, and our Reach Me line extension program, which is really intended to reach those places that, as Krem mentioned earlier, that tend to get left out, particularly in rural communities where the long dirt road does not get served, but there is a provider there that could, given a bit of incentive, reach that part of the community. We've also worked to explore other technologies and really understand the benefit of those technologies through the Jumpstart Connectivity Initiative, and work to build the capacity of our partners and communities through our Get Ready Technical Assistance Program, working to bring many hands to the work to help communities get ready and think about their infrastructure solutions. And of course, the regional and tribal broadband partners have been a significant benefit, working with us to engage not just geographically, but with many of the other partners that are connecting with underserved individuals within their regions as well. So all of these things taken together represent most of that all-in approach. What's not reflected here, as we have continued to work very quickly, of course, as Jeff mentioned, is the middle mile network, MooseNet, that was funded by NTIA, will be launched and be working on that moving forward. And also the Partnerships Enabling Middle Mile program, which is a proactive approach to those public-private partnerships and we're just working to award the first grants in that program. And as we go into 2024, there'll be just a significant additions and expansion of this work of the all-in approach, further refining these programs to deploy our BEAD funding in the best and most strategic way possible, launching a Connectivity Hubs grant program with our Capital Projects Fund funding to support really world-class facilities and multi-use facilities that are in alignment with our digital equity goals throughout the state. And then we'll layer more direct funding and investment in the other elements of digital equity beyond the really urgent need to address access and affordability. We'll also be investing very deliberately in digital skills and technical support, internet safety training and education, and of course, really working to ensure that our government resources are more accessible and inclusive. So that's just a snapshot of that all-in approach, which I think is moving us in the right direction and braiding together the many different funding sources that we have to have maximum impact.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maggie, for that overview. And of course, adding to that pile, Maine's BEAD allocation is $271.9 million. And the middle mile application, the project total is $53 million, and the grant award is 32 million? 32 or 35? Geez, how can I not remember that, Jeff? 32, thank you. It seems odd to say, but we realized in the midst of all of these numbers that even with the BEAD allocation where it was, we still have over 90,000 locations that are unserved and underserved within the state of Maine. And we knew that even with that number, we were going to be very close to being not able to meet all of those, not able to serve those locations. We knew that that was going to be cutting it very close. We also knew that that was going to leave us really at the point of not being able to get to those non-deployment activities. And so in order to fund and sustain in an ongoing way, needs such as the things that have been identified in our digital equity plan, it is really important that we looked at ongoing capital sources. And so something that I think that Maine has done that's really innovative is our CFO, David Weddick, came to us with the idea for a capital markets task force to bring together thought leaders in finance from not only the state of Maine, but from around the East Coast to say, we need to think about the capital sources that are available and that are missing from projects within the state of Maine, and think about how do we bring them to the table and what creative approaches do we need to be thinking about taking. And we have a fantastic group of thought leaders who get together every couple of months, and we bring problems to them to solve and to think about. And it has been an incredibly enriching group to work with because they have wonderful ideas and represent some really fantastic resources that when we get to the point where we are, Maggie's been thinking about how do we build that sustainable infrastructure for the digital equity goals that we've articulated. We need to have funding sources identified, and the ways that we will do that will call on some of these resources that broadband capital market task force has identified. So it's that we know that there are additional needs out there, and we're thinking proactively about how to identify those. And it still feels weird to me to say, after seeing all those millions of dollars, to feel like there is still a need out there. But when you look at the magnitude of, we are bringing people infrastructure, they need to know what to do with that infrastructure. So that leads to the next set of questions. Marika, I would love to hear you start us off to talk a little bit about what do you think are Maine's biggest challenges when it comes to achieving digital equity? You are in such a great position, having been on the front lines and seeing digital equity in this space for such a long time. Can you talk a little bit about Barry, could you go to the slide after, or the second slide with the questions? Thank you. What do you think are the biggest challenges that we have when it comes to digital equity, and what are the opportunities you see?
Sure. Thank you, Tanya. So I was thinking, going back to when Jeff was starting out and he said, what is unique about Maine? I thought he was going to go in a totally different route to talk about the groundwork that is laid in some of Maine's anchor institutions, the schools and the libraries. And so I'll come back to that thought because I think it's really important for this conversation. But I want to also echo what Maggie was saying in the all-in approach of marrying the digital equity work that is happening in the state with the broadband access side. It's so rare that that happens. And in my opinion, it's something that makes any investment not sustainable, right? Is that you have to deal with both. And actually, I would throw the affordability in there too. And MCA is doing a lot of work with the Affordable Connectivity Program too, which I don't think anyone mentioned yet. But to pull all those three things together and address them simultaneously, I think leverages federal and state and local funds that are being dedicated to each one. If you deal with them individually, I think you miss a lot of opportunities. It's really important to make sure that the people, once they are connected, understanding that that is a huge challenge here in Maine, but once they are connected, that they're able to use that connectivity to address whatever life needs are coming at them, whether it's workforce or education or just staying connected in this global world that Karen mentioned, right? So thinking about what existing infrastructure is there and investing in that is something that I think is a challenge, but also an opportunity. So from the perspective of libraries, thanks to Network Maine, almost all of our libraries have access to a gigabit of connectivity, which is something very unique, and I think goes no small way into some of the opportunities ahead. So related to the challenges, I think from the library perspective, we have 256 libraries kind of spread out across the state, very much in the home rule challenge that they are different, even though they offer some of the same services. But it really is up to that local community to decide what they're investing in their library and that kind of thing. But that said, we have that infrastructure in place. All of those libraries have that kind of internet connection. They provide public access computers. Some are lending tablets and hotspots and things like that. And we have people there who are kind of the historic information navigator and now really pivoting to becoming the digital navigator. I think a challenge is to build the capacity of libraries to be that source, that digital navigator source. It's conversations that are happening across the country, but I think there's a real opportunity here in Maine because of something else that is unique. We have the National Digital Equity Center, which has for many, many years been providing people that resource that is often lacking, people to help individuals navigate the online world. And an opportunity there, I think, is to marry some of the work that the National Digital Equity Center is doing with the libraries, where we have that connectivity. So there's a few things. I can obviously go on and on about that, but a few things I wanted to make sure to highlight.
Fantastic. Thank you. Others have challenges and opportunities? Yeah, Maggie.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because Marika set this up so well, that when we were engaging in the process of developing the digital equity plan and undertaking, as all the states did, our asset inventory, I think many of our partners were encouraged by, the significant core partners in the digital equity work that we have in Maine. And Marika mentioned National Digital Equity Center and the network of libraries and our adult education programs and Give IT, Get IT, which is a key device refurbishment partner. And I think it's both a challenge and an opportunity that we have these wonderful core partners doing significant elements of this work. And the opportunity is to scale them up, to expand their reach and ensure that we can maximize those core assets. And then I think the other really wonderful thing that came out of the digital equity planning process is just the identification of those networks of organizations and community partners that have such close relationships with underserved individuals and communities, and the opportunity to really infuse digital inclusion activities into those existing networks is a really important one in Maine. And it's things like the community action programs that are all over the state and have wonderful relationships with many of the covered populations. We have a strong network of reentry and recovery programs that are working with folks who are formerly incarcerated, and helping with that reentry process. And just so many of those just networks and coalitions. Oh, and of course, the network of age-friendly communities in Maine, which I think we have more age-friendly communities than almost any other state, and just wonderful partners working with older adults all over the state. So just so much opportunity came out of that digital equity planning process, and very excited to get started with our funding to implement many of those opportunities.
Fantastic. Do others have contributions in terms of challenges and opportunities with digital equity?
I have one thing that Maggie reminded me of just very briefly. It's a little bit tangential, but I think also relevant, is access to digital resources that are culturally relevant to the covered populations. And I think that that's something that is an ongoing challenge, to make sure that once people are online and they're developing the skills, that they have access to those relevant resources. And the other thing I think that sometimes gets left out of the conversation related to the skills support is that because technology is always evolving, your skills need to evolve along with that. And so you have to kind of continually reinvent or build on the support systems that are in place to allow for that growth, recognizing that there are probably always also going to be people who are at the entry level. So that spectrum of skills, I think, is really important to keep in mind in that conversation.
Definitely. Thank you. So this one is a little different, and I'm really excited to hear Nick talk about this. This is one that we talked about in our preparations for this. And I think this is something that Maine has talked a lot about, but I am also interested to learn if other states are talking about this in particular. The relationship between connectivity and climate change. I know Island Institute has been very involved in this. I've actually spent some time thinking and writing about this as I've been preparing our initial proposal, which if other state SBLNs are watching this, they're thinking about this as well right now, because it's part of the requirements for BEAD funding. But I think it's so important to think about connectivity and the relationship between connectivity and climate change. So Nick, can you start us off, and then others jump in if you have thoughts about this?
Sure, I'll jump in, maybe with a little preface that for much of the last 5 years, the Island Institute has been very active in the Maine's Climate Council process, developing a statewide climate action plan. We've been very active in broadband. We've also been active in climate change. I love talking about climate change with broadband people, and I really like talking about broadband with, anyway, I like talking about these two things in these two different audiences. So I think climate change really comes up in 4 different areas in talking about broadband. And so the first one, it was called out in Maine's climate action plan, Maine Won't Wait. And that's around reducing vehicle miles traveled. 54% of Maine's CO2 emissions come from our transportation sector. We are a very rural state. We've talked a lot about that. We drive old cars in this state. All of those combine to make it very challenging to think about how the state moves forward in reducing vehicle miles traveled. Broadband allows us to change how people relate to transportation and cars in ways that unlock other opportunities. The Island Institute, we work in parts of the state where people drive multiple hours, 2-3 hours, to go to a medical appointment, to go to visit a doctor. Some of these visits can be done virtually. Some of them can be done remotely if you have a good internet connection. If you don't have a good internet connection, you're spending hours and hours driving across rural parts of our parts of our state. And so it's not a direct one-for-one better broadband reduces vehicle miles traveled, but it really enables the people thinking about how we solve some of our rural transportation issues to have a few more tools, or it unlocks opportunities for them in ways that I think will be really helpful. That's the way that most people think about it. The other way that is common in a lot of conversations is the electric grid and connected infrastructure and smart infrastructure. But I think for Maine, the biggest benefits that we're going to see are going to come in adaptation. We have many communities that are on the front lines of climate change. They're feeling the impacts of warming waters, of changing weather patterns. And for our natural resource dependent communities, those changes put a lot of pressure on the community structure, on the economic structure, the social structure, and broadband is an absolutely critical component to helping these communities move forward. And whether it's a ski mountain town out in Western Maine in Franklin County, or a fishing community in Down East Maine in Washington County, having broadband allows people options and the opportunity to continue to make a living, even in the face of climate change, in the face of significant changes in traditional economic activity. And the last piece I would just say, for much of Maine, and I think rural parts of the country everywhere, if you've been left behind by the digital revolution, if you've been left behind by broadband, all of the promises, you'll get a connection, everybody's going to get a connection, we're going to solve the broadband challenges. I think, and you've spent years, decades, not having a connection that enables remote work, not having a connection that enables you to participate in modern society. I think you start to lose your faith in government institutions, and you lose your faith that the government cares about rural parts of the state. And so for me, very deeply, solving broadband is a precursor to being able to go into rural communities and talk about how climate change, there might be opportunities for that community. There might be economic opportunities. There might be new things coming that the community could benefit from climate change. It's really hard to say that if you're like, great, there's nobody can join this Zoom because you can't have your videos on, or you can't connect to Zoom. It's really hard to believe that there's anything good coming from a project to address climate change. And so I think those are a couple of big areas, and we're really excited about some of the work happening in Maine's fishing communities around connectivity hubs and around helping fishermen who are facing pretty significant pressures in their community, in their business, and they might want to think about getting into another line of work. There's a whole bunch of cultural barriers to for many of these rural populations in accessing statewide resources, being able to connect locally with them through those trusted partners, those people they're already going to provide services, to help them get online, help them access some of the trainings that we've talked a little bit about. It's huge for these communities, and it's huge for the families who depend on that.
That's fantastic. It's so helpful to hear that overview and to think about the intersection of that work with climate change and broadband. Do others have thoughts about this line of thinking? Karen,
Yeah.
from an infrastructure perspective, or Jeff? Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, you want to go first?
Okay, sure. I can provide a real world example of the impact of connectivity in terms of climate changes that Nick was talking about. Less cars on the road. University has been a national leader in distance learning since the late 80s, early 90s, using various technologies. In order to do that, we've maintained over 20 education centers, off-campus centers across the state into the rural parts, with the goal being having it such that nobody in Maine has to drive more than an hour to reach an opportunity for higher education. Well, that was okay thinking back in the late 80s, early 90s, and to be honest, many, many years after that. We're now to the point where we have two of the centers that happen to be located in communities that some local ISP has made significant investments in. One is up in Holton, the other one's down in Mid-Coast in Belfast, where we're able to rethink the purpose of those centers. We no longer offer on-site classes at them. We're not doing distance learning at them, and are exploring ways to really either divest in those properties or turn them around to provide better opportunities through some other public service organization there. Those are the first two communities that we've seen. Largely, I mean, one, because of the investments made, people are now able to take their coursework at home, which even 4 years ago, that wasn't a possibility in those communities. And I see that as the final progression, as the faculty and the students have become more comfortable taking online. And then finally, we're reaching that last mile. We're finally getting that connectivity to home. We're going to be able to pull back much of the need, at least, for these higher education centers in their traditional roles, and hopefully be able to bring greater value in some other way.
Yeah, I would add two very quick things. One is the power consumed by a fiber optic infrastructure network is approximately 50% less than cable coax or copper DSL networks. That's a documented fact by us. The second thing is, which is interesting, is given that Northern New England is aerial, there is a greater need for these aerial networks to be climate resilient.
Mhm.
So in terms of the networks being redundant, resilient, robust, it requires intentionality, it requires attention, and frankly, it also requires additional capital upfront, which saves the day, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15, 20 years from now. So those two things go hand in hand together, but it's clearly become something upfront and center for a lot of my peers and colleagues in the ecosystems.
Absolutely. And certainly something we're thinking about as we're preparing to deploy this, transformational amount of money. We want to make an investment, and we want to make it once and make it right in a way that is protected, because we know that these, storms, these weather events, they're going to get more frequent, more severe, and we want to make sure that the standards for the investment in the technology are appropriate, so that we don't have to have people going back out and redoing that because we didn't put in place the appropriate standards. So.
Yep.
Anybody else on this topic before we switch gears a little bit?
I would just add, Tanya, to your point about the resiliency of the infrastructure itself. I think as we experience more of these extreme weather events, and even, on a related note, public safety emergencies, being connected in your community and being connected individually is just so important to finding the resources and support you need through important, scary times like that. And we very recently had the experience of all of us being glued to our news to understand what was happening as we were sheltering in place. It just emphasized for me how important it is to be connected at those times.
Absolutely, Maggie. It's a great example. I know I've read so much about how communities in general are more resilient if they are more connected. And it also speaks to the need for us as a state to think about how broadband and cellular connectivity are part of critical emergency response plans, and part of how communities are getting important information in times of crisis, and staying connected, and what those backup plans are and redundancy plans are, so that people can stay connected in those times. So last question before we open it for Q&A from the participants. We want to know, are there any surprises about this work? I mean, some of you have been in this for a while, so there've probably been some good surprises and some bad surprises, and also successes to share. Sort of a nice opportunity to share some closing thoughts. some surprises or some successes that you would want to share with the folks that are watching along with us?
I'll share a good success and a surprise. Community that we were working with, rural in nature, because of a fiber optic infrastructure. I believe over the course of 2 years, they've had 12 young families move into the community, which also resulted in their school actually becoming long-term sustainable.
Awesome.
Which is actually pretty neat. These are young families, so professionals that moved in, from out of state with young families, and they're going to be there for now at least a generation or two. And I think that those are good things to celebrate.
Absolutely. And for folks watching who are not in Maine or not as familiar with Maine, when Nick talks about one-room schoolhouses and Karam talks about 12 families moving in, making the difference between schools being sustainable or not sustainable, it's absolutely the truth. It can make a huge difference in rural communities. That is how small the populations are, and it really can make a difference. Anyone else want to share?
I'll share one brief surprise and then two successes that are just top of mind. My first on the surprise front is that as we were doing our focus groups leading into the digital equity and BEAD planning processes, the number of people who didn't understand or know where their internet connectivity came from or if they had it, I thought was surprising and very helpful for our learning and also for the next round of focus groups and surveying that we do as we're measuring progress. Two successes, the regional and tribal broadband partners. These are the 13 partners that have been working with us for the last year and about to start year 2. Were such a significant part of the digital equity and BEAD planning process and convened coalitions in every region of the state working with covered populations. So they convened 180 partners through their coalition building process and really expanded the reach of our interviews with individuals to contribute to the plan. I think they did almost 600 interviews of folks with lived experience to contribute to that planning process, which was so important. And last success, I think I would just point to our tribal communities in Maine who have been engaging and working on broadband connectivity and digital equity, and particularly the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township, which has worked collaboratively with the state and with Pioneer to build out connectivity to almost all of their locations and soon to get to the rest of them, and have really engaged in digital inclusion activity that is maximizing that investment and working on telehealth pilot programs and ACP enrollment of tribal members. And it's just one of the very inspiring stories in our tribal communities that are so important to the Maine landscape and communities.
Thank you for mentioning that, Maggie. It's really important. I think successes from our perspective are related to the partnerships that have been established and strengthened through MCA's organization. And from the library perspective, I think I mentioned the need for greater capacity for libraries to provide the digital skills and support and programming and things like that. So for me to hear small libraries and talk about one-room schools, we have one-room libraries as well. Many of them are on the islands, as a matter of fact. The majority of our libraries serve our small communities. It's something like 70% serve towns of 5,000 or fewer. But for those libraries to be raising their hand and saying, how can I be involved and how can I help? And to recognize that they have a role to play in their communities. And these are libraries that are run by one person, so they're doing everything in addition to their regular library programming. To say that I want to help and that this is a priority in my community has been a really good success from our perspective.
I would just add on the partner side of things, I think one of the successes in Maine is that we have a very active and engaged group of people, organizations who care about broadband and care about what it means for people, for communities, for the state. And that produces a very broad and robust and rich broadband conversation. And it has been happening for years. And so I think that sets us up really well for success as we're looking at this. The broadband conversation in Maine is so much more than an ISP talking with a state agency about how to get money out the door. It's about, what does all of this mean? What does all of this work mean for our communities? What does it enable for our communities? What can we do together once we have this broadband that was impossible before? I think that's a great success for the state.
Fantastic. Okay, that brings us to the end of our panelist discussion questions that we had. Any closing thoughts before we move to Q&A? Thank you all so much. Back to you, Barry.
Well, we have one question here that I think it may have already been answered, but I'll share it with everybody. This is actually a question for Karen regarding emissions of fiber versus cable. Well, he's seen the questioner because she did identify herself, Amy Stuyvesant of Merit. She has seen studies of this sort before, have been looking for similar studies that compare carbon emissions from fiber versus fixed wireless. And I'm guessing that when she talks about carbon emissions, she's talking about sort of like an end-to-end, not that the cables themselves are guilty of emitting excess carbon, but you know, when you think about that infrastructure, do you have any insight in how these technologies compare?
As I mentioned, I have not seen a direct study because I think a comprehensive approach is going to require a deep dive. You're looking, an end-to-end carbon emission lifecycle analysis includes the manufacturing, it includes the transportation, it includes operations, maintenance, component level sustainability metrics. It's a whole gamut. So I have not seen it. I would not venture how they would stack up, because it also depends on where things are getting manufactured and transported from. So it's an enormously complex value chain and a supply chain that addresses two very distinct ecosystems that operate in many places in conjunction with one another, and in some places independent of one another. So, you know, for example, you know, fixed wireless, the backhaul is fiber. So how do you disproportionate that kind of an analysis and do it appropriately? So it also has some dependencies on the geography of it. So you have to probably normalize some functions. So fairly complex, I would imagine, which is probably why we haven't seen it out there. I would think.
There was a study more than a decade ago that was done by Canary, which is the Canadian Research and Education Network, on this topic of how fiber deployment, fiber-based networks reduces the carbon footprint of telecommunications network. So Amy, if you poke around Canary a bit, you might find it. I'll try to look in my records and happy to drop it to you, Amy, if I find it.
Sure, and that's certainly a very challenging question to answer when you talk about the total lifetime cost or fiber burden, I guess, of a technology. We have another question. This one is from Chip Byers. Have the entities in your state always been cooperative, or has the external funding encouraged such an all-in approach? Interesting aspect. Does dangling some money out there encourage people to play together, I guess?
I would actually say the long-time lack of money and significant need in our communities encouraged cooperation amongst the entities, because that was the only way there was any possible way of making headway. I think it's also worth noting that, the state has this set of partners who are working together. There are ISPs who are involved in the Maine Broadband Coalition and groups that are working to move broadband forward. There are also ISPs who are not involved and haven't been, and there's been friction along the way between some ISPs, or the goals that some ISPs have and the goals that those working on broadband for the benefit of communities have. Not to say it's all roses, but I think the lack of money had a bigger impact than anything else. It's also worth saying, I think Maggie, in her position at the Maine Community Foundation prior to joining the Maine Connectivity Authority, used a little bit of money from the foundation to seed a whole bunch of really, really important broadband work in the state and support communities in planning both infrastructure and in digital equity, well before we were really talking about having a joined up conversation of those things. And I think the genesis of much of what has happened in Maine comes from some of that early funding.
So nice of you to say, Nick. But
It's
I would
true.
say, I would return the compliment to say that our experience jumping into the work of broadband and digital equity from the Maine Community Foundation side is that the partners were very welcoming to any additional partners coming into the field, and collaborated significantly from the beginning. And just one example of this is that we created a volunteer grant committee, which Nick and Karen both served on, and some of our other partners. And everyone said yes, who we asked to participate in that process. And then Peggy Schaefer, who was the director of Connect Maine at the time, said, why don't we closely link our state funding and the community foundation funding, so that we're learning from both of these experiences and bringing what we learn to the other process. So created a very collaborative connection between the community foundation and Connect Maine at the time, while also engaging the other partners. So I think Nick is right that the collaboration and the partnerships were in existence well before significant funding was on the table. And the passage of the bond campaign was another example of those partnerships at work.
I also think it's cultural. I mean, we are a living manifestation of 2 degrees of separation from each other, maybe 3 on a bad day. So, the environment encourages, inculcates, and fosters cooperation and collaboration and co-opetition, because we know that otherwise the miseries of life may compound itself over a course of time. So everybody knows everybody. So negotiation, cooperation, living together becomes the order of the day.
The funding has been nice to allow all the organizations who are currently regional and tribal broadband partners to effectively resource the work at the scale it needs to be resourced at to participate in the process. There are a number of organizations who are supporting these regional conversations have been able to add a staff person, a whole FTE, which is really important. If you're at a nonprofit and somebody's like, here's a little bit of money to go do a ton of work, and we're going to give you enough for half an FTE, that's really hard to navigate through. And so just the amount of funding and how it's been structured has helped organizations have the capacity to collaborate.
There's certainly been that culture of collaboration since probably forever in this state. We survive on, well, put it a different way, our greatest strength is how poor we are, because we can't afford to do anything on our own. We can't do it twice, right? Especially some of the southern New England states in the research and education realm. Within a state, they'll have multiple research and education networks. That couldn't be even fathomed here in Maine. In fact, we look at it and say, we can't really afford to have much of what we do without people all getting together, chipping in any way that they can, right? You find partnerships to get things done. I like to call it spending money more than once. How do you value stack every dollar that you spend so you get a greater return? So I think what the federal funds are doing in the state, which people have already alluded to, is giving a voice to those on the demand side that have not had the opportunity to be heard because of that lack of funding to be able to drive those kind of conversations and awareness. So that's really exciting to see.
Well, Tanya, we don't have any other questions from the audience right now. We do have a few more minutes if I don't know if any of the panelists have questions for each other, or Tanya, if you have a question for the group.
I think we've gone through just about all of them. If anybody else has anything they want to add or anything that they didn't get to. I know, Marika, you talked a little bit about when Jeff started to talk about what's different about Maine, specifically about schools and libraries, if you want to circle back to that.
Yeah, yes, I can. And this is maybe from my perspective outside of Maine, particularly with libraries, but I believe it's still the case. It's very rare that rural libraries have access to a gigabit up synchronous. And when you have that, it takes away many of the challenges because you don't have to think about that piece of the infrastructure anymore. You can just say, oh, I want to do a telework program in my library. It's not the broadband that is going to limit that happening. And for the rural communities, that opens up a whole new set of opportunities through the libraries. So I think that that's something that we should talk about all the time because it is so rare in other states, particularly thinking about how small our libraries are and the communities that they're serving. They, if you don't have ideally, we think everybody should have a broadband connection at home, but until that happens, having a place to go where we serve everybody, anybody can come in, you don't have to have a membership or anything, and use that connectivity. And if the library's closed, many of our libraries have always left their Wi-Fi on 24/7, but during the pandemic, many of them actually were able to use some of the recovery funds and strengthen that Wi-Fi connection. So we have stories of people pulling up in their cars, which is not ideal, I know, in a Maine winter, but it's that cobbled together attitude to make things work. So that's something I think we can always call attention to.
And that's a good example of how public policy shaped something. The School and Library Network, we call it the Maine School and Library Network, MSLN, was funded originally by a rate case against the incumbent by the Public Utilities Commission. I'm going to skip all kinds of details, but what ended up out of that rate case was that every K-12 school, and what's unique, public library received connectivity to the internet and amongst themselves. And it was really the start of our large-scale research and education network. We've leveraged the buying power of that mass of K-12 and public libraries to help drive investments by the private sector into communities to get that gigabit connectivity to an island, to a deep peninsula off the, down the coast of Maine, that they could never do on an individual case-by-case basis. It's by bringing resources together to do that. And that's something we have an opportunity to do again here with these federal funds, is looking at a broader picture and saying, how do we get more out of the limited dollars we have? Because even 271 million isn't going to be enough.
Absolutely. And how, Jeff, to that point, and Marika, how do we make sure that libraries are properly resourced to provide the support system? Because libraries were not designed to also provide the support for tech support to help people with their digital skills and to understand how to update their devices and how to provide all those support resources that go along with it. One of the things that surprised me so much out of the digital equity and broadband planning work that we did was how many times we heard people say that their tech support system was their grandchildren. Over and over and over again. So the tech support grandkids are really the heroes of the day. That's not a sustainable system. They're going to move away eventually. My tech support kid just moved away. We need to have a sustainable system. And so being able to have an infrastructure where we're able to, you know, set up the resources in the places where they belong, where the infrastructure and the people with the skills can support people, to give them what they need to be able to then support themselves. That really creates a perfect system.
Okay, well, Tanya, maybe that's a good note to end on then. So let me share my screen here for just a minute, as I do have just a couple things that I wanted to share before we wrap up here. And okay, I am going to master this here. This is the button I'm looking for. Okay, so let me thank everybody for joining us today for this very enlightening and stimulating discussion. I think it probably has brought some ideas that everybody can take back to their own situation. But as we close, I would like to say a few words on behalf of the Marconi Society. If you enjoyed an event like today's, we offer a variety of other networking opportunities. You've seen how we manage events. If you visit our website, you can find our magazine there as well. And also, if you become a Marconi Society member, you will also receive the monthly newsletter. So please consider doing that, or contact my colleague, Yemedi. You see her email address there at the bottom of the screen. We'd be happy to help you with those activities as well. That said, again, thanks everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Networking Maine, the Network Startup Resource Center, and the Quilt, along with the Marconi Society, thanks again for being part of today's event. And once again, if you'd like to join our mailing list, the URL is right there. If you just go to marconisociety.org, you'll find that link very readily there as well.